Hi, my name's Chris, and I play Minecraft as Applejinx, and I am here to beg for a certain type of feature, certain types of things, and we'll demonstrate it like this. As you can see, I'm going through these. I may have to go past it a couple of times, please don't mind that. I'm setting all of these to 1 octave because I'm going to demonstrate how some of these things work as promptly as I can. Oh, went a little past there. We're trying to do the simplest possible case here of how this works. So we'll go to 24 octaves, and we're setting the Y Lurp factor to 0 because I'm demonstrating something using that. I'm going to skip through here, ignore that, ignore this. We'll also ignore that for the time being. We'll leave that stock. We're also not touching that either. These things have been removed from the terrain generation by what Mojang is doing. The same person, the Mog Miner, produced Wedge, which is this program, and also the new custom terrain thing. Now these are some of the controls people want to see, but this is trivial. What I'm here to do is demonstrate what some of the non-trivial ones are. Notably, see back to 0, back to page 1, and we've got just noise 6, which is I think the largest scale noise. What these are is 6 different levels of a kind of randomness. And this is the biggest one, and this is the littlest one, and they sort of overlay on top of each other. That's how we make the terrain, and I will show that. Oh, this is the randomize button. Never hit that. That is just a lame way of doing it. And it produces nothing but crazy terrains that are like, oh, how cool this looks, and then it's useless and you can't actually play on it. This time we'll try Lurp factor of 0, and we're not even going to fuss with these things because I might have to grind through this a lot in order to make it work. Our preview looks like this. So here we are in a world which has just one level of Perlin noise and no interpolation at all. This is what that looks like. We can go over here and we can see a number of things. One of them is that we're using no interpolation. That's what Lurp means, is interpolation, on the X and Z. For that reason, it's completely squared off. We're also using no interpolation on the Y coordinate, and for that reason, Y is nothing but vertical cliffs. Happen to be about 16 blocks tall. It's about the size of a chunk or something. 16, 8, looks more like 8. Yeah, it's about 8 blocks tall. And with this, we can start to see what the shapes of Perlin noise look like. Perlin noise is a three-dimensional thing. It's not just drawing out the shape of a map on the ground and then doing something to make it be taller. The noise sort of permeates all space. We can see it here with the occasional little funny glitches. I'm not even sure how that, oh, I can see how that was made. We've got some things like caves cutting through there. Caves have been added to this afterwards, but you can clearly see what part is the cave and what part is the terrain generation because of the choices that I made. This is being run, again, with no interpolation. The thing called Lurp is at 0, and it's just one level of noise. You can fly way up and you can see that it's fairly large spaces. It's not really broken up very much. And the shape of the border is pretty direct. If you ever saw a picture of Perlin noise, it's sort of a lumpy looking thing and it's kind of rounded. And in order to get fine details on it, you have to do smaller octaves. Smaller octaves means get noise in which, like you see that S curve here that I'm tracing with my mouse? If you had a smaller octave, there would be many of those, and they'd be about as big as the borders of the lava lakes. The lava lakes are being generated differently, but see the difference in size between this and the edge of the lake? The edge of the lake might be done by a smaller Perlin noise. In fact, we can set a smaller Perlin noise to do exactly that. Then you overlay it on the first one and get a more complicated thing. And we will see that now. Now, Wedge is going to be good enough to leave us this settings as long as it doesn't crash. If it does crash, I'll just put it all back again. And I tried earlier and found that using the largest 2 octaves at 20 gives a neat result. The preview window will show us that. As you can see, we are seeing some stuff going on here. Now, one thing to know about is that the total number contained in all of this gives you the intensity of the world. Basically, as the number gets higher, the terrain basically comes through the air. I'll explain more of that when I get back into this next world, and I'll also explain Lurp. But 6 of number 20 and 5 of number 20 gives a more complicated look to it. And here we are. As you can see, Lurp is still set to nothing. There's no interpolation around the edges of any of these things. We're sort of looking over a, oh, look, we got a desert temple. These other features, like the lakes and things like that, are going to continue to appear, so just try to ignore them because that's not what we're talking about now. However, you can see that the shapes of these boundaries are slightly more complicated than they were. This is no longer just one level of Perlin noise, making very predictable curves. Instead, it's 2 levels combined with each other. So it's making less predictable curves. You can see where some kind of generation thing has made it a little more subtle there, but the big blocky stuff is what the overall terrain generation is doing. And you can see that in this case, it's swooping around here. Again, think of it as a noise function that fills all the space, and when it goes up a level like this, it's not because we did another generation. This noise shape is extending farther, like the density of stuff here, and we're high in the air, as you can see. That's a cloud. But the density of stuff here, this is a higher number. It's such a high number that it's beyond the threshold, saying that this is the middle of the Earth. This is dirt at this point. If I was using a smaller number for the noise factor other than the 20 and 20, it'd probably be down below the cloud level. But here the level of the noise is so high that it's all going to be solid. This expanse is all solid. And then over here is where the 3D noise shape, it's like a cloud, and there's a billow of solid cloud in here. And as a result of that, this area is solid. And then you can see another cliff over there, and that area is solid. And we can see there is a sort of valley through here. That's not a chasm being generated. That's not a ravine. That's a natural part of the terrain formation that we can work with. And again, you can see how the curve sort of goes over through there and continues going off that way. But this little outcropping here, and these 2 sort of cavey areas there are part of combining the two noise sources. As we continue to do that, it'll get more and more complicated until it gets real choppy and busy. And if you start including the higher octaves, then you get much more of a capacity for these strange little quirks, these little details and funny characteristics in here. Now the next thing that we're going to do, since we've established that two different Perlin noise things laid on top of each other can make a more interesting shape, and people have talked about how they don't like how there's blocky shapes that come about. This is a perfect example of this. We have a nice curve here, and it comes through here, straightens out a little bit, and then right over in this corner, this is a big blocky shape, and that's a naturally blocky shape. If you continued using layers of Perlin noise, higher octaves, as we call them, for smaller and smaller features, usually that works by using the smaller and smaller features and making them more and more subtle as you go. But you'd still get these squarish things because Minecraft is made of cubes, and because as you increase the noise, you increase the ability for a squared off feature or whatever to break through the rounded shapes. If you wanted all rounded shapes, you would want only one octave of Perlin noise in a very, very simple arrangement. For instance, if you're doing a desert world, you'd probably want to use only one octave of Perlin noise and just work with that, or maybe make very subtle changes to it, but you'd be using the largest octave and then go with that. And you'd be using a lot of interpolation, which brings us to Lurp. Lurp is something that we want to have control over, and that's one of the primary reasons I'm making this video. I'm begging for Lurp. Here we have what is probably the smoothest sort of Lurp you can have. The numbers seem to line up in such a way with Wedge that having Lurp at about 0.25, or we can get 0.24 and that's all we can get, is a smooth effect, and you will see it. You can go to 0.5, but it gets kind of speckly. I will show that also. 0.24. And note that we're still leaving Ylurp at 0. And there's a reason for that. Aha. Behold Lurp. This is the same thing that we had before. It is the two levels of the largest two octaves of the Perlin noise. And this also will this is also the largest two octaves of Perlin noise in the height dimension as well. This is not just operating on the X and Z, this is also operating on Y, but what I've done with Y is I have left it to be completely not interpolated. So we're getting cliffs. This is essentially the rice paddies arrangement that I talked about on Reddit. It's possible with this kind of thing to cause a biome to be built of exclusively rice paddies. And everything is a cliff, and here's a wonderful example of the interpolation. You can see with the two levels of randomness, some of it is very smooth. It breaks up a little bit. And the top of this cliff is a wonderfully natural shape. That's actually helped by the fact that we don't have many levels of many octaves. This is just two octaves at about equal amplitude. So it's an interesting curvy shape, but it doesn't have much in the way of funny spikes, except for we get down here. All of a sudden we do have a funny spike. That sticks right out. But the reason it sticks right out is because that's part of what you get when you combine two octaves of Perlin noise. That is a sort of sticky outy place. And it's a natural phenomenon of the noise being what it is. If we had lots of octaves combined together, which I might do next, we could have the cliff maybe spiking out into a funny little spike and then going back. we can have all those funny little characteristics, the crazy stuff that people love so much when they get into the terrain generation and want to see nothing but crazy, crazy looking terrains. And you gotta admit, you haven't seen terrains like this all that often. When you say crazy terrains, I've never seen anybody actually post things like this before. And yet it has its own its own challenges. For instance, you'd have to put up ladders to get up there, or jump down into pools of water. And there's a whole range of things that you could do with a world composed entirely of plateaus like this. Now, using smaller numbers, using large numbers of octaves of Perlin noise and combining them means we start getting more scattered results. It's hanging around being fairly direct, and I think that some of this is ravines being put in. But these structures, the ones that are clearly not interpolated height-wise, that is showing you the shapes that we're getting out of this stuff. And as you can see, with 3 different noise generators getting involved at equal levels, we are getting more little details, we're getting more little spikes. And when we get to an area where we have a lot of, like we can see the edges of this ravine, and this is showing us how the algorithm is behaving. That's what I was looking for. We can see that we have funny little qualities like this. This is an artifact of the 3 different noise generations combining together. When they are all at equal levels, that means that they will be fighting with each other and doing more bizarre things. Again, you can also see here, this is a very straight line. That's a natural phenomenon of the way that these things are combining with each other. It also means that you're not getting the even rolling hills and things that you might have hoped to have, because the competing random noise generators are, they're conflicting with each other in such a way that they have a very high capacity for combining and doing unusual, incongruous things. Like this, for instance, I think this might even be, that might be part of the lake though. But as this stuff starts to combine, what we start to see is this. See these odd little sort of mesas in the middle of the regular terrain? As you increase the number of random things showing up, you will inevitably get islands that are floating in the sky. Because this area is an area where all of these random things that we're combining combine together to say this is so very much Earth. This is not air. The gradient between 0 being air and 1 being terrain, this went really far towards 1, so it's really pegging out right here. And since it's a 3D function, they won't necessarily end up being as high, for instance, here. You might have the 3D function making those 3 randomnesses go to a very high level up here, and the one might be a sort of shape that swerves this way, and the other one might be coming from over here, and its high number is coming from that direction. And if they swoop off in different directions, and this area under here is no longer a high number, or whatever it is that they use for solid ground, then this under here naturally becomes empty air. And that's where the crazy floating islands come from. They come from the same phenomenon that we're seeing in this little solid thing there that we wouldn't see if we were mostly working on one Perlin noise generator and using the other ones to just perturb it a little bit. That we can demonstrate next. Now what we have here is a setup in which, and let's bump this up a little bit while we're at it. The single largest Perlin noise generator, which makes these large rolling hills, is set very high. But all these other ones are set very low, and they're all set about the same. What this is going to do is cause the large scale size of the terrain to be having a large effect, but then the perturbations of it breaking up the predictable look, the predictable sort of sand dunes look of the thing, are going to be very complicated because all of these are working together at a much lower level. And the first octave is probably going to dominate because it is the smallest one. It's happening at the highest frequency, so the terrain things that they produce are going to be most obvious. Here's a little glimpse of what that would look like in the previewer. And we'll see it now if Minecraft doesn't crash on me. So as you can see, I'm still not interpolating the vertical stuff. That's so that we can see what it's doing. But when we get up a little higher, we can see that the large-scale terrain effects are really very much a large scale. This is scaled up as much as I can do it using the octaves alone. And it swoops up to that point over many of these little cliffs. But then when we start looking at the shapes here, we're seeing all kinds of funny characteristics. Like rather than being just a very smooth quality, what we have is mostly smoothed out, but then with some very strange little quirks in there. The largest Perlin noise generator is creating the large terrain features, and the combination of the many small ones is creating small terrain features. For instance, this is not being produced through any sort of cave generation or something like that. This is being produced through the terrain generation alone. It's a tiny little bit that's not being interpolated in any way, where the shape of this contour not only came to a point, but it came to a point and then tucked in here. If you continue to add octaves, it would probably refine it. Well, I don't think it could refine it because we have to work on the size of a block. Like we can't make it smaller than that. But you can see how it's trying to swoop in and making a peculiar little shape. If we were using a smaller number for those small Perlin noise octaves, this would be a smaller feature. It might not even go and create this effect at all. If we were using a larger number, we'd have lots of those things and it would start looking really speckly and spiky and stuff. We can also swoop over here and see similar characteristics. Like here, this swoops around here and then ducks in and sort of bounces out again. We even have a spike that goes tucking right in there. Now the thing to remember, and this is a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate it, is that this works 3D. Well, except for that cave was added afterwards. You can tell because it's not a 16 or an 8-bit, an 8-chunk tall cliff. These things you can tell are coming from the straight terrain generation because they are 8-chunk tall cliffs, or block tall cliffs. I'm derping that all up. You get the idea. You can see it because you can see how it's interacting with the octaves. Because you can see how the octaves are distinct from what Minecraft does after the fact to add things like lakes and such. And caves. You can see some caves down here too. Also note the extent to which this is producing big rolling hills. It's got the little details as far as the quirky behaviors and stuff from the smaller octaves, but the large amount of energy put into that last octave is what's creating this large scale terrain. We have real mountain shapes and it's going down to, well, you might, no, you're not above the clouds, there they are. It's swooping up to the mountain shapes. This is about the point in which we say this is actually a 3D function. It's not being done in discrete chunks. Like we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different 8-block levels there. But it's not generating it as separate 8-block levels. We're just not interpolating, and we could be interpolating the Y as well. And clearly that's the next thing to do. If that's true, then we could make Y be 12 and then Y be 06, and that would be accurate. That's 07. And preview looks like it might be trying to be smooth there. We'll have a look at that because there's no point in looking at crazy floating island stuff. Everybody else does that. We can see that if we're using a Y Lurp of 0.07, which is roughly a quarter of what the previous one was, or roughly I was calculating it out in the belief that I was going to get it to be about smooth terrains. It's not actually doing that, but it's giving an interesting result. If you can manipulate Lurp independently, what you can do is get these sort of terraced effects. There's some nice flat areas, and then this again looks like rice paddies, but this time you can climb up them. So we're back in here. I'm going to take this down to 13, or maybe 14. And we previously were doing 24, and I can show you what happens when you have the Y Lurp to be too high. The preview shows that there is going to be some floating islands there. You can even see them. And when we translate that into Minecraft, and what we can see is that if you have Lurp to a high level, Lurp is, I think I had it at the same as the Lurp for X and Z. This is causing a peculiar effect. X and Z are still making the shapes that we want, but the vertical thing, it's continually sort of zipping in and out, and that's an artifact of the way interpolation can work. It is essentially the algorithm for working out whether there is ground or sky is scooting back and forth between 0 and 1, or whatever it is calculating. So this is what we know as a mistake and a derp, and not necessarily what we want. However, it is producing layers upon layers of floating terrains and things. And you can plainly see that this is mob heaven. And they will be generating inside all of these overhangs. And we're going to go back, and this time we're going to put Lurp to 12, half of what the X was, and see whether that's going to give us what we want. It's looking promising because you can see the smoothness of this render. The preview is definitely showing some desirable qualities. So we're going to go back in now, and this is what you can have by having just one primary, and we'll simplify it also. But if you're using mostly one octave of Perlin noise generation and then using the other ones to perturb it, what you get is breaking up the phenomenon of the regularity there. See, this is not being generated by a ravine tool. This is being generated by the terrain generator itself. This will be level in the ridge. That's because the main terrain thing had an area of coming through and being very strong in the air, swooping through here. You can see how regular it is. You can predict how that goes. And then we also have the smaller level stuff perturbing it, so that we've got this little block here And that's being generated by all the other ones at smaller amounts. If you set all of the other ones, other than that one primary one, to an even smaller number, you'd be less likely to see these little bits sticking out here and there. If you set it to a larger number, you'd see more of those things, and you'd start to see the projections and the funny little spikes and bits of floating islands and stuff like that. But the end result of using this type of generation and being able to individually control octaves and being able to individually control Lurp between X and Y, or indeed in general, means that the range of possible terrains you can generate can be very high. Oh, that's a cave, that's not a terrain at all. Imagine playing Minecraft and coming across a mountain range. And needing to climb up the mountain range. Perhaps even with things like the snow-capped mountains, height having to do with the mountains being colder and having snow. Using the terrain generator and using the octaves in this way, getting individual control of the octaves and what you're doing with them, means you can generate stuff like this out of Minecraft's actual algorithm. This isn't with one of the world painter tools. There is a universe of this out there. This goes on forever, just like regular Minecraft does. You can swoop up here, you could make a house here, enjoy your terrain view, and continue climbing your mountains until you got to the top. We're probably limited by height limit or something like that, but we're also at 145, which is a darn tall mountain. Then we can go down from here. It's a little difficult to see through the clouds, but you can listen to the annoying sounding cows and look out over this area. And again, our terrain generation is causing these features, but it's not perturbing things so much that it's just all chaos. Instead, we have the capacity for large-scale terrain stuff. If we had a sea level that was, I do currently have a sea level that is very low, but if you set the sea level to be down around 16 or whatever, you could have mountains and then look far off and see ocean far down below you from the top of the mountain. And of course, we can also do things, seeing as we have determined that setting Lurp to 24 and setting the Y-Lurp in this particular default setting to 12 gives us interpolation over every aspect of things. That means we can start fooling around with it in other ways as well. For instance, what if we wanted it not to be quite as perturbed as this? This is still, I wouldn't call it treacherous. You can get around on this terrain pretty well. You don't really have to stretch it out in order to be able to get around on it. But supposing you wanted the things to be maybe a little more broken up than this, but also less perturbed by small blocks poking out. What we do is this. And this is very much what people are not really used to doing with terrain generation. I see people continually using terrain generation to just make complete craziness and be happy with that, and we can do so much better than that. But what we're going to do in this case is we're going to drop all the extra octaves down from 3 to 2. Slightly less perturbation of that. And then we're going to take these 2 octaves, drop this to 10, and put this to 10. These will combine, so we'll have a slightly more complicated look to things, but then the small perturbations are going to be less. And again, we can make it look more like rice paddies by taking the Y Lurp and not interpolating quite as much as we did. And we can also make the roundness of the curves of the terrain be more squared off by reducing the X and Z Lurp, or we can make it become a chaotic mass of spikes by increasing this. But what we're going to do right now is leave this at the smoothest possible factor for the settings that this came with, and look at what these octave settings do. Using the two largest octaves and combining them together means that they're averaging out to some extent. What we're getting is an area that is a mass of little tiny hills. It's a lot of jumping around, and it's on a much lower level here. There's a lot going on, but it's all very tightly packed. As we go into here, we start to see a larger terrain feature. But since we have the two are set to only 10, we're not seeing that much as far as large level terrain features. We can see a little bit more over here as we come to a swamp. This stuff is all fairly choppy, and then the swamp is dropping down a bit. And it's a bit smoother. And one thing that you can see as we zoom up a little bit is when we're combining two different, zoomed up too much. When we're combining two different octaves of Perlin noise, we will tend to spike out the small details and average out what else is there. It's not really giving us that much in the way of huge mountains anymore, or tiny little, well, it's giving us tiny little stuff, that's not what I mean. It's not giving us huge mountains and sloped areas. What it's giving us is sort of pits in the ground. And that's exacerbated by the fact that we've got the other noise generators in there. As the more they average out, the more you get a chaos of just stuff. And now we're going to see what happens if we, say, drop these down to just 1. Since that doesn't go very high up, we're going to give this a 12, and then we're also going to give this one a 12. And we'll see what it looks like when we have a larger scaled one and a much smaller scaled one kind of fighting each other. The preview will tell us some things, and one of the things the preview is telling us is that we're getting some real tall mountains here. But there's nothing like seeing it in actual Minecraft. So, here we have the largest size Perlin noise, which in this particular mod is octave 6. Combined with octave, I think it was 4, and then everything else is kept very minimum. And these are clashing in a more interesting way. They're not canceling out quite so much. What's happening is that you're always going to have a lot of activity at the smallest octave that you're using. The more you push that up, the more stuff is going to be in there making chaos. But you're also going to have activity at the largest setting that you use. Now, the way that worked, the previous one probably had areas where we had big changes in altitude. It was hard to see them because they tended to overlap and average out, and you'd have to travel to find them. This one, on the other hand, is another story entirely, in that it's got big features and the medium features, and those are both pushing a lot of amplitude change. And remember, this is not just height change. The octaves I'm using are also changing the intensity of, how chaotic the contour lines would be, because that's what we get when we get rid of the Y interpolation, right? We get contour lines. And as a result, this particular setting with the octaves is giving us some dynamite mountains that are real challenging, and then also plains underneath. It's producing plateaus. And this area, for instance, would be very easy to get around in a horse. Or on a horse, rather. This is also produced by the terrain generation. I think it may be, no, that's not it. Here's where we can use a torch and go and see what that produced. This is being produced by that combination of, I think, the 4th octave and the 6th octave at a fairly high amount. I could pull back the 4th octave if I wanted it to be a little less choppy, and push up the 6th octave if I wanted more in the way of huge mountains. And it's producing a cave system beyond what Minecraft's cave system is producing. I don't think this is necessarily Minecraft's cave system producing this. This is an artifact of the terrain generation. It'll intersect with Minecraft's own caves. So, since I have claimed that I can probably control this terrain by fooling with the octaves, and this is why I'm making this video to beg and plead for special control of the octaves and the Lurps and things. If possible, we could even have them biome dependent. Certain things could be done biome dependent. We can't actually change octaves in a biome dependent way because it's going to create weird chunk boundary errors. The octaves have to be consistent over the entire Minecraft world. But certain things like the Lurps could be biome dependent because those are calculated on a chunk by chunk basis. And you could have an area where you went to, say, I don't know, tundra or something, or deserts could be much more smoothed out, and then an area such as this, plains, you could have that be the rice paddies, and you could have that be much more in the way of these flat areas. And what we were going to do was try to make it so that we had more of that really large-scale continental stuff, and then the crazy choppy stuff was going to be a little smaller, but still be a factor. We've got everything down to 1 here. We're going to push this up to, say, I think I had it at nearly 20 when there was nothing but that. And we're going to try to blend 3 and 4 to have a more interesting choppy effect on the perturbations, but we're leaving 1, 2, and 5 as 1. I'd like to set them to 0 if I could, but this one is not currently letting me do that. That would be a great feature to have. And we'll try both of these at 9. Actually, I'm going to go with this one being at 8 because the higher frequency ones tend to predominate. They have a larger effect. We could even have it be 7 and 9. And that will make the medium terrain stuff more choppy, but it will probably also average out the same way it did when we had 5 and 6 at equal levels. In fact, if I push it to 8 and 9, it'll probably do it even more. What this should produce, if we're doing it right, is large-scale mountainous terrain, like whole continents, giant mountains, with most of it being fairly smooth, but then details in smaller scale popping out because the 3 and the 4 octaves are next to each other, which means that they will generally cancel out. And then when they don't cancel out, they will make sharp and obvious features. Preview tells us that it looks like it's going to work. Most of that looks very smooth, and it's certainly covering a large range of area, but we also see some detail in there. So it's time to see what we got. So this is a natural plateau also. It's a result of the largest scale Perlin noise being a very high setting, and then those other two, like I said, they average out. when they are close to each other in settings and they're close to each other in frequency, you'll get them combining in some ways, and then stuff will happen where we've got this natural site over here. Let's fly over there and have a look at that. There's a natural thing. This whole thing is a little higher than it needs to be, perhaps. We don't really need to have these mountains quite this epic. But to my mind, this is much more epic than those visions of incredibly densely packed spikes full of holes and overhangs and stuff. This is like a natural, this is like the Grand Canyon. It's a product of the Perlin noise, but it is just, you know, climbable, manageable. And I can see a little hint of those that terraced effect from the Lurp not quite lining up. I can boost that a little bit also when I'm doing my next go, but here's what we can get out of this algorithm with the independent control of octaves. It's a very high up in the sky jungle there. You can get a real mountainous effect. And over here we have an area where the three large-scale Perlin noises are really spiking out. They are really leading to striking results. This is the kind of thing that we got our most amazing natural terrain out of in regular Minecraft. It's just a way of exploiting it. You can do it accidentally, but you can also do it by knowing what you're doing and how to exploit the terrain generation. So I've effectively created this on purpose. Here we are in some plains. In these plains you can navigate and you can go around on them, but they're still showing characteristics that are appealing. This is not stopping you from running quickly across them. You can really, you know, kick butt and run fast over this area. But it's very distinct high ground, very distinct low ground. This would be great for ultra hardcore games. So you don't really have, I mean, the mountaintops are very accessible. So let's finish this off by going in one more time. And we're going to cut back the overall height of everything. And we're going to cut back the choppiness very slightly. Not too aggressively, but we're going to cut back the choppiness very slightly. And the overall number of, we're going to reduce all the numbers so that the height of everything is slightly less than it is. And then we're also going to make a point of reducing those two higher frequency ones that are causing the choppiness to be so incredibly exaggerated. But we're going to keep the two where they are, distinct from the largest one, which is causing the biggest scale stuff. We're going to make them a little smaller, but we're going to keep them what they are because they are producing the density of terrain features here. Instead of 347, we'll try double it. And Y scale can be a little larger as well. We'll see what that does. I don't know what the scale, this could be a divisor. It could be dividing of some way. Because it's not really marked. We don't know what it does. And we have sea level at a reasonable height. Now we'll go around a little bit and see what we have as far as mountains are concerned. Our shorelines are being set by the combination of octaves in our noise generation. This is going to be creating different shapes of things than you might be used to seeing from Minecraft because it's a slight variation on how it normally works. We've got mostly just one big octave, and then we've got a couple of smaller octaves giving less of a contribution, and then 3 more that are giving the smallest contribution I can get. And here's what we've got. We've got a terrain with plateaus where the 2 smaller contributions average out. And we successfully made the mountains be way up above the clouds. They're not quite like the regular mountains. I think they go up about as high as they can. But in Minecraft, generally the mountains are a lot choppier because they have more octaves involved in their Perlin noise generation. This has fewer octaves, so it behaves more like a mesa. It's big flat tops on it. Honestly, if the mesas and things are using different variations on the generator, it would be great to have access to that as well. So here we go. After about an hour and a half of recording and hopefully less than an hour of final edited video, we've got a world generation that's generating amazing views, giant mountains, which are not too blocky. They're using the interpolation properly. They have flat plateaus all over them so that you can build things on them. You can generally get up or down them because they're not all vertical drops, although you'll have some vertical drops. We'll have more vertical drops if we increase the frequency of those other ones, and that might be worth one final tweak, seeing as we've got everything else going pretty good. And then we have smooth areas sort of all through the middle where the smaller frequencies combine and cancel each other out. So let's do our one last little tweak. Now, there is something to be said for editing this terrain generation stuff so that you can do with things like getting C more easily, or scaling everything up and down more easily. Because it's not that unreasonable to expect an offset factor. If you get everything exactly the way you want, you say, okay, drop everything by 20 blocks and you'll be fine. So anytime we spawn, we could be spawning high up in the air, or we could be spawning way down low. There's no real way to predict that. I do see that a lot of this is under the clouds, and that's good. It's more or less going over the clouds, which is less good. Since I don't have a convenient way of scaling everything up and down, what I'm going to need to do is essentially dial back that largest scale Perlin noise generator that's giving me those enormous mountains. Hopefully if I pull it back just by 1, it'll still be something useful. But yeah, the Mog Miner is going over this in the attempt to make it so that people can actually modify it and get what they want out of it, which is a wonderful thing to do. It's just really important to keep it so that people who are able to do crazy things with it can also get what they want. And we'll put on stats and go and jump in the lake. Okay, it's at 65 again. Actually, it's at 66. So we successfully have ocean. And now we're going to see what our mountains look like here. And again, the shape of these continents is being formed by the variations on octaves that we're giving. Specifically, what we're doing is we're giving a really powerful 6th octave, which is the low frequency one that makes the biggest terrain features. And then all the other ones are much smaller, and the 5th octave is completely missing. It would be the same thing as having the biggest one be there and then having all the other ones be all much higher frequency. What we're getting is a fairly chaotic random look to the actual hills and things. And you know, we're doing pretty good, but that's not necessarily what we want. We're going to have a look at one more tweak, because of course you always have to do one more tweak. And here we are. We've got mountain ranges that are really mountain ranges. That goes right up to cloud level. And you can see the height of the mountain ranges, and you can really get a sense of the overall space of everything. And then we've got 3 different Perlin noises at different frequencies, all sort of conflicting with each other. So, pardon me. One of the things we're going to get is really striking, unusual details jumping out. You could still climb up a lot at that. It's not being overridden so intensely. It's still kind of choppy. I'm pretty sure we still have sea level around here somewhere. I don't think that's it though. But it is still kind of choppy, and I'm wondering whether maybe that's too choppy. So you know what we're going to do? How are we doing? You going to be good? Give us a world. And not a white screen. And at this point we have beaten on it so hard that it is curled up and died. But I hope that my principle has been established. The fact that I couldn't actually get it to do everything that I wanted, I got pretty close. And we'll just edit out there.